Fault lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. We are talking
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are joined by our guest, Caleb Maupin. He is a speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, and author. His new book, Kamala Harris and the Future of America, an essay in 3 parts, examines the life of Kamala Harris and puts her rise to prominence in the context of changing U.S. political discourse and the geopolitical stage. And by the way, you can and you should follow Caleb on Twitter at Caleb Maupin and read his articles at calebmaupin.com. By the way, just spelling that for you, CalebMaupin.com. Anyway, Caleb, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
I'm great. How are you?
Good. Better for having you on. Let's get into a conversation about 2 revolutions, about a century and a half apart, placed in history, both taking place on January 1st of the years, although we're talking about Haiti and Cuba. In the case of the Haitian Revolution, it had been going on for well over a decade by the time the independence was announced on January 1st. I think it was, 1804? We're just talking about this with Margaret Kimberly. Anyway, we're coming back to this topic with you. Let's start with Cuba, actually, the more recent one. If you're willing, could you please just give us, maybe to do another take on this, could you give us your overview of the sort of key facts and factors, give us some of the context for the Cuban Revolution, what led to it, what actually happened, and what was its immediate aftermath? Caleb.
Well, the Batista government that was supported by the United States in Cuba was known for corruption, known for impoverishing the population, and kind of used the country as kind of a tourist haven for wealthy, criminal interests in the United States. And much of the population remained deeply impoverished and, just a huge amount of underdevelopment. You had Fidel Castro and the July 26th movement that took power and transformed the country. At first it was simply a revolution for democracy and national independence. In 1961, the Cuban Revolution was announced to be a socialist revolution. They nationalized the major centers of economic power, began receiving aid from the Soviet Union, and the achievements of the Cuban Revolution are quite tremendous in terms of wiping out illiteracy, in terms of raising living standards and the life expectancy, in terms of industrializing the country. And, the Cuban Revolution has had many, many great achievements, and those achievements are not limited simply to Cuba. I mean, Cuba sends medical aid all over the world. Cuba sends its literacy volunteers all over the world to help educate people. And Cuba is widely admired. Its medical school has been called the greatest in the world by Ban Ki-moon, the former UN General Secretary. And Cuba is widely recognized for its achievements in terms of creating a modern healthcare system, in terms of advancing human literacy, and in terms of giving aid and medical assistance to people around the world. It's widely recognized for those achievements by international bodies, despite being just a small island. The fact that just a small island can have such a global impact really kind of shows how important the Cuban Revolution was.
Yeah, the medical part is important, but let's not undercut the highest and the most important thing that Cuba is given the world, which is, of course, the cigars, the Cuban cigars. No, the medical thing is pretty phenomenal, considering it's, like you said, it's such a tiny island. How did they break away? This is always the interesting thing, whether we're talking about Haiti or whether we're talking about Cuba. It seems that the mechanics of it, especially when you have this kind of superpower that's backing the government, to keep that government in place, the repressive government. How did the people within the context of that government break away, pull the yoke off in order to kind of fight back what ultimately ended up was always going to be a military conflict or revolution, I should say?
Well, there were divisions within Cuba's ruling class, no doubt about it. And Fidel Castro was from a very wealthy family, but he went into exile. He was able to return and launch a guerrilla uprising against the government. Then you had in the urban centers the labor unions supporting his move and going on strike, and you had Che Guevara operating a radio program, broadcasting to the population and firing up the population against the old regime. And one thing led to another, and strategic alliances were made. And the ultimate result was Fidel Castro becoming the leader of the country and the July 26th movement taking power. What's interesting is that the Cuban Communist Party is a merger of three major political forces in the country that were key in bringing down the Batista regime. That would be Fidel Castro's July 26th movement, as well as the Popular Socialist Party, which was like the Marxist Party, as well as a youth activist group called Democratic Youth that had been involved as well. And those three entities eventually merged into what is today called the Cuban Communist Party and leads the country.
That is fascinating. When they made that choice to rebel, I would imagine, how did they... I'm always fascinated by the mechanics of the vote to rebel, because at some point there has to be a conversation that takes place of sovereignty, or whatever we consider to be the sovereign is no longer the sovereign, that there's some kind of dual control or dual fight in regards to governance, where an aspect or a group within the context of the society decides to push back, and the population makes a choice somewhere along the line of saying, this is what we want, or that's what we want, even if that choice is just not to get engaged or not to get involved because the government has alienated the society itself. The choice to fight in this sense, whether it's in Cuba, whether it's in Haiti, or for that matter, whether it's in Zimbabwe, does the mechanics of this end up being somewhat the same? Like they like to say when a body dies that it sends the organ shut down in a similar way. Is that something similar in the way that these revolutions basically took control or took power?
Well, John F. Kennedy said that those who make peaceful revolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable. And that in every one of these instances you described, this wasn't an act of adventurism. This wasn't an isolated group of people going out and engaging in provocative acts of violence. It was rather the result of peaceful democratic struggles for many decades not succeeding, and the ability of people to peacefully organize and fight for better conditions, within the structures that existed, being cut off. And as a result of that, people essentially engaging in acts of self-defense. The Cuban Revolution was largely an act of self-defense on the part of a population that was fighting for its life and had been battered and destroyed and suffered so much under the brutal dictatorship that really they saw no choice. It was a kill or be killed situation, and they ultimately, took up arms to overthrow the government. And you can compare it to the founding fathers of the United States and how they made that similar decision. And that it's important to distinguish between left adventurism and punchism, Blanquism, and other deviations, and actual, principled decisions made by mass organizers who would prefer a peaceful transition to a better society, but are forced by conditions and by the old regime to take up arms.
You mentioned, actually, I want to go back to another aspect of this that you had mentioned earlier in your introduction. From 1902 to 1959, when the revolution, took place. What did the Cuban government during those years do wrong? What were they doing specifically in order to ignore what sort of vested interests were they serving? Can you just describe that for us, Caleb?
Well, it was a process of keeping the country under the control of foreign corporations and largely keeping it underdeveloped. I think there's a really big misconception people have. They think that, Western corporations and Wall Street are going around the world developing the world. But what they actually do is they go down around the world and they hold back development. They keep countries as captive markets that don't develop their own industries, don't raise their people up out of poverty, and are kind of forced to buy most of their products from the West. And while Cuba is, it certainly produces a lot of sugar, and certainly was a great holiday getaway and tourist spot. It never really developed in terms of building up its own industries, in terms of raising the standard of living of its population, in terms of building a modern educational system or a modern healthcare system. Because it was a captive market of Western corporations, it never really was able to break free. And the Cuban Revolution was that process by which Cuba could break free, could build up its own industries, could build up its own education system, its own healthcare system, could raise its people up out of poverty. And it has done very, very, very well in doing that. If you compare the life expectancy of the Cuban people with the life expectancy of people in the Dominican Republic or Haiti or Honduras or Guatemala or many countries throughout that region, you'll see the Cubans are living very well. They're living much longer. They have a much lower infant mortality rate. They have much more access to things like employment and education. And the achievements of the Cuban Revolution are quite significant.
I would like to juxtapose or compare, and then this is somewhat of a hard comparison or an odd comparison, but I'm just going to put it and see if you understand what I'm getting at. In the United States, oftentimes when we see protests and we see people pushing back, there's always a privileged class, almost like a liberal group, that would look at what's taking place in regards to the protests and say, oh, those people should do this in a different way. That, oh, it shouldn't be that aggressive. It shouldn't be that loud. It shouldn't be that violent. The thing about revolutions that I always find interesting is that there is a condition that precedes the revolution. Sometimes there are people who are putting through reforms, but oftentimes it's people who are kept in horrible conditions. I like to say hurt people hurt people. And the revolution and the violence that the revolution basically uncorks was basically the kinetic expression of the hurt that those people were experiencing over the course of decades, if not centuries prior. Can you speak to that? That basically what the violence that people see released in these revolutions, and you can pick pretty much any of them, oftentimes are a direct representation of what those people experienced under the yoke of whatever system they were under prior. Basically, hurt people hurt people. The revolution is in real part a reflection of what the people encountered. Could you speak to that? Like violence in many of these situations is almost a mechanical process that in order to get freedom, you almost have to go to X lengths because liberation is not necessarily on the table as part of the discussion under normal circumstances.
Indeed. Well, it's interesting because there is kind of a point of confusion. Some people argue that or mistakenly believe that bad conditions in themselves make a revolution, right? That when people are suffering as a natural result of their suffering, you have a revolution. Well, if that were the case, there would have been a revolution every day during the Middle Ages because people were starving and desperate and in very poor conditions as peasants. That revolutions are generally a response to a situation in which the old order is called into question so much and so significantly that even within the old ruling class, there are questions about who should be in power. When society is not able to function in the old way, the anger that's boiling beneath the surface among people who are suffering in the old society tends to come to the surface in ways that it wouldn't normally manifest itself. And that there's usually some kind of breakdown in the structure of society that then empowers that anger to be kind of unleashed. And that's one thing that many people don't seem to realize. Often preceding a revolution, what you have is you have conditions dramatically worsening worsening in a very significant way, combined with the fact that you have a significant force within the country, some kind of revolutionary organization that is able to significantly harness the frustrations of the dramatic decrease in conditions and dramatic loss of abilities. In some cases, you have a situation where revolutions are almost people fighting back and demanding to retain rights that they already have. It's through the process of peaceful struggle, people have gained significant things. They've gained more democratic rights. They've gained more access to to resources, and then suddenly there's an effort by the old order to roll some of that back, and that can result in a revolution as well. There are many studies of this. In the 1930s, there was a book published called The Anatomy of a Revolution, and it was used by Zbigniew Brzezinski and other anti-communist scholars as kind of their textbook of how anti-capitalist revolutions tend to happen. And even today, that book is considered to be kind of an authoritative source if you look into the details of how revolutions happen and how revolutionary forces are able to maneuver into coming to power.
Very cool. I am going to check that book out. I've been on a reading binge recently, so I would definitely add that to my reading list. The voice that you guys are listening to, Caleb Maupin, speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, and author. His new book, Kamala Harris and the Future of America, an essay in 3 parts, examines the life of Kamala Harris and puts her rise to prominence in the context of changing U.S. political discourse and the geopolitical stage. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines. We divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today. Get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. Joining us is Caleb Maupin, speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, and author. His new book, Kamala Harris and the Future of America, an essay in 3 parts, examines the life of Kamala Harris and puts her rise to prominence in the context of changing U.S. political discourse and the geopolitical stage. Speaking of Kamala Harris, since you wrote the book on her, Caleb, I'm glad to have you here. There's an aspect of this. We're talking about the revolutions, but I'd be remiss if I didn't bring this up since it just happened. There were several things that happened. Kamala Harris has a history of just being flagrantly, radically, emancipatorily, and I know that part's not a word, disingenuous. And she does this constantly. Whether it was the support for Medicare for all when it wasn't really Medicare for all, the marijuana stuff, giggling and laughing, talking about putting people in prison about her smoking when she was asked about this. And recently, this. Oh, and you also had the thing about Joe Biden, where she was talking about the busing thing. She was like, how was that black child, Joe Biden? It was that moment. So then you have this recently. In a wide-ranging interview with the magazine, Harris, the child of immigrants from India and Jamaica, remembered the first civil rights march she attended in a stroller from which she fell, getting separated from her family. Quote, my mother tells me the story how I'm fussing, Harris told Ashley C. Ford at Elle magazine. Quote, and she's like, baby, what do you want? What do you need? And I just looked at her and I said, freedom! I just said freedom. Interestingly enough, this sounds extremely familiar. The reason it sounds familiar is because Martin Luther King says something similar a while back. Martin Luther King. I will never forget the moment in Birmingham when a white policeman accosted a little Negro girl, 7 or 8 years old, who was walking in a demonstration with her mother. Quote, what do you want? Unquote, the policeman asked her gruffly, and the little girl looked him straight in the eye and answered, freedom. She couldn't even pronounce it, but she knew. It was beautiful. Many times when I have been in sorely trying situations, the memory of that little one has come to mind and has buoyed me. Who knew that Martin Luther King was talking about Kamala Harris? That's pretty astonishing that they have the exact same story. Is this something that has just been a part of her repertoire? This just making stuff up flagrantly like this, or this pleasurizing? I mean, this is astonishing that somebody would do this again. I mean, this is the second time she's gotten caught with this.
Well, is it possible that similar incidents took place? I mean, let's not rule that out. And to be fair, is it possible that perhaps Kamala's mother made this story up and told it to Kamala, and she believed it, and her mother is the one who plagiarized it from Dr. Martin Luther King, as many parents will take cute anecdotes about other people's children and make them about themselves. And we really don't know the basis of this. But I think the reason this is getting so much play is because of Kamala's long record of being disingenuous. Many people see Kamala Harris's attempts to paint herself as this iconic, figure associated with civil rights who was so adorable as a child. Look, you could buy a T-shirt with an image of her 10-year-old self on it. Many find the Kamala Harris attempted mass-marketed personality cult to be a little bit disingenuous. It just doesn't catch on. Obama was very much able to sell himself, and Obama really was able to win the loyalty of very, very big sections of the population, both black and white. Obama was able to really kind of capture people's imagination. Kamala Harris seems to not be able to do so very well, and every time she tries to escalate the adorableness and the lovableness of her story, it seems to kind of backfire, and this is yet another example of that.
I think it's because Obama's inauthenticity was authentic. Meaning, like, for example, the hope and change doesn't mean anything. It's this kind of saccharine, this sugary thing that you give to people where they leave feeling a particular way about it. But he sells it so well. He croons so well. He plays basketball. Like, all of these things are like him managing an image. And he manages the image well, and it suits him well. It makes it seem almost natural. Same thing with Michelle Obama. She doesn't do this well. And it really does. Like, the giggling, like, just when Tulsi Gabbard ate her alive in that 30-second just takedown, the thing is, like, the giggling and everything else just comes across really, really inauthentic. That's all. I don't want to dwell on this one. I just wanted to point this out since you wrote the book on this, and kind of, this was one of the things that was floating around. It's like, oh my God, she's doing it again. I want to get back to something that matters, and that's the revolution stuff, because I do think that stuff is fascinating, especially in our own political climate, where it seems like our government is incapable of doing the most basic of things to deal with the population issues. I mean, like, we can't even get the radicals in our government, supposedly the lefties, to do something that I don't even think is all that radical at all, which is pushing back against the way our system is basically currently running. And I think my fear, and the reason I've been focusing so much on the revolution stuff, is because, if it becomes impossible, where we have one aspect of the political space that is supposed to attend to be the release valve of the capitalistic system in the way Chris Hedges says, and it no longer does that, then what happens to the government when reform becomes impossible? That's my concern. What does that look like? I want to get to the Haitian Revolution also. What are the differences between these two revolutions? And maybe the differences is less important. What do these revolutions have to teach us today in our current time frame in the United States?
Well, the Haitian Revolution was the result of slavery, and it was a mass uprising against slavery on the Haitian island. And the people rose up against it. And what's quite fascinating is there was actually a division among the United States about how to respond to it. I believe Alexander Hamilton was one of the few leaders of the United States at the time who favored giving recognition to the Haitian revolutionary government. But that revolution happened, and it was, many people argue that it was more in line with the values that the French Revolution had attempted to carry out in France, and that it was almost a more true expression of some of the values of liberty, equality, and fraternity that the French Revolution had been inspired by and rallied around. That's the argument that C.L.R. James makes in his very widely studied book, Black Jacobins, about the history of the Haitian Revolution. But it was an uprising against slavery, and Haiti has been harshly punished for that revolution ever since. For many years, it was paying reparations to France for this revolution. It was forced to pay the former colonizer reparations for the crime of having a revolution. And many look at the economic devastation and the conditions currently facing Haiti and say that this is a continued result of the fact that it's never really been forgiven for the fact that it was the first country of enslaved people to rise up and establish their independence.
And this was it was effectively contemporaneous throughout its entire period with the French Revolution. Isn't that right? I think the Haitian Revolution started in the early 1790s, so maybe 1791 or 2 or 3, and effectively ended in 1804. That's roughly the same time period, a little bit after the French Revolution, but effectively overlapping with it in broad strokes. Am I right there, first of all? And then second of all, how do you think that affected it? Why do you think the Haitian Revolution was truer to the form or the spirit of the French Revolution than that was itself? Caleb.
Well, I mean, they certainly overlapped, and that there was, in French society and among the French colonies, there was a widespread feeling that people should have some level of democratic rights, and that it almost kind of reveals the level of hypocrisy on the part of the French revolutionaries that while they were fighting for liberty, equality, fraternity in France, when the people of Haiti rose up and didn't want to be enslaved any longer, they did not support it. And that there seemed to be no real desire to break the shackles of colonialism on the part of the French revolutionary governments that emerged, whether it be the immediate aftermath of the revolution, or even especially in the Napoleonic era. And that, Napoleon himself had been, a colonizer. He had played a role in colonizing Syria and Egypt, and attempting to bring the Middle East under French domination. And that in a lot of ways, the French Revolution, despite having very egalitarian desires and seeking to build, a classless world in some cases, you see even kind of a utopian socialist edge in some of the French revolutionary writings. Despite that, the needs of the people in the colonized world for independence and the abolition of slavery outside of France itself was not discussed. And it certainly was discussed in Haiti. So in a way, you could argue that Haiti was more true to the French revolutionary principles.
That's fascinating. Speaking of the French Revolution, we might as well add that one in also. Where did the Commune go wrong? Meaning French, let's say, within the context of Paris, they are able to establish a commune, but it doesn't last long. It's basically crushed remorselessly. What did they get wrong? Meaning, what did they not understand that, let's say, maybe that the Bolsheviks did when they were trying to establish a system? And I'm not trying to make a comparison between the two. I'm just trying to say that one was able to establish a government, whether it was flawed or not, but the other one was crushed. What did they miss?
One?
Well, 1871 is when you had the establishment, very briefly, of the Paris Commune, which Karl Marx called the first dictatorship of the proletariat in history. It was referred to the communards storming heaven. And Marx at first didn't support it. When there was talk of establishing the Paris Commune, he wrote that it was not a good idea. But then when it happened afterwards, he was in admiration of it and supported it. He made criticism about the fact that the banks were never seized, and about the fact that there were a lot of things in terms of changing property relations that could have changed quicker and didn't, and that there was not enough of an effort to spread beyond Paris, that you can't really have, socialism in one city.
Caleb, I'm going to have to end it there. And I should have asked that one earlier, because this is going to get into a whole nother fascinating conversation. I'm going to say Caleb Maupin, speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, and author. His new book, Kamala Harris and the Future of America, an essay in 3 parts, examines the life of Kamala Harris and puts her rise to prominence in the context of changing U.S. political discourse and the geopolitical stage. You can follow Caleb on Twitter at Caleb Maupin and read his articles at calebmaupin.com. This is Fault Lines with Thomas Stranahan. We will be back in a moment with headlines.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.